Hi, this is Uncommon Sense from the Sociological Review Foundation. I'm Rosie Hancock in Sydney, Australia.
And I'm Amit Singh in Manchester in the UK, filling in for Alexis. And this show is all about taking everyday words and ideas we often think we know about and finding a way to see them more critically, with the plan being that by the end, we've communicated what it means to think sociologically in the broadest sense.
Today we're looking at something very close to our hearts here at Uncommon Sense because we are seriously spread across global time zones. Someone is always up really late, another person is always up super early in the morning, and coffee is absolutely essential to our process. And that is going to be our theme for today, coffee, or rather coffee culture.
It's something that might at first glance to some seem a little bit unacademic, but actually talk about coffee and you pretty quickly get to big themes like colonialism, capitalism, work, public space, and of course, conviviality, which to me is the notion that broadly refers to our capacity to live with difference in a kind of everyday, mundane way. It's something that I've been exploring recently along with colleagues, looking at the convivial possibilities in pubs that are often seen as traditionally English social spaces, for a particular focus on desi pubs, that is Indian-owned pubs. Maybe more on that a little later.
Yeah, coffee culture has already been explored by some big name thinkers, whether we're talking about Jürgen Habermas, who wrote of the role of the coffee house in the rise of the public sphere in parts of Europe, or Ray Oldenburg, who in the 80s developed the idea of the third place, which is something we're surely all more familiar with in this post-pandemic era of working from home or the local coffee shop.
And today we're with someone who we're going to add to that tradition. She's the anthropologist Grazia Ting Deng, a European Commission Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow at the University of Venice, and also affiliated with Brown in the US, from where she joins us today. Her book, Chinese Espresso, has just come out exploring why and how coffee bars in Italy, typically seen as such distinctively Italian spaces, have been increasingly managed by Chinese baristas since the 2008 recession.
Hi, Grazia. I guess if we were in a live studio, someone would be getting you a coffee. But given our subject today, what would you be drinking?
More recently, I drink more tea than coffee. But when I have to write, I always have a coffee, like Italian espresso. I have an espresso machine at home. So American coffee for me is too much. It's just too strong. Yeah. You know how Italians call American coffee? They call it dirty water.
So rude.
Yeah, Italians are really proud of their own coffee, and coffee culture, of course. Yeah.
Okay, hi Grazia. So your research for Chinese Espresso saw you base yourself in Bologna in around 2012, I think. And it all started when you heard, with initial disbelief, about coffee shops run by Chinese baristas. That sparked your curiosity about what you call in the book, the paradox of Chinese espresso. What is that? And what kind of research questions did that prompt for you?
I think in the beginning, more than the research question, is about my personal curiosity. So I lived in Italy before. I know that coffee bars and espresso coffee are very important for Italians. It's an integral part of their local urban culture. But I never thought at that moment, the first time when I was in Italy, that there would be one day the Chinese are taking over coffee bars and selling espresso coffee to local Italians. First time when I knew this become a thing, I was like, I can't believe that. I would like to know more. So I asked my friends in Bologna and in other cities, so can you just go around to see if you can meet any coffee bars run by Chinese? And a friend in Bologna told me that from his home to school, there were 20. I was like, okay, this is my project. And talking about the research question, there are some things that I would like to emphasize before the question itself. So first of all, there are some facts. So espresso is kind of an Italian national icon, a symbol of made in Italy, right? And then coffee bars are everywhere in Italy. So no matter where you go, in the cities, in the provincial towns, even in the countryside, you will meet coffee bars. In Italian, they call it bar. And the Chinese immigrants in Italy are famous for not being integrated. They have their own communities. They don't interact with local populations that much, at least according to the Italian local populations. So when Chinese are buying local coffee bars, it's something that cannot be expected, right? usually we say Chinese tea, but not Chinese coffee, right? So it's kind of incompatible. The two terms kind of incompatible. So my question, the first question, which is also like ethnographic question, is why and how these Chinese immigrants who are supposed to be culture outsiders could make good coffee and even manage coffee bars that are rooted in Italy's everyday urban culture.
I mean, you're right. Coffee seems like such a quintessentially Italian thing. I've been to Italy once and spent, I think every day, twice a day, went to those little stand-up coffee bars and just felt like it was, oh, I'm so Italian doing this. And it's so interesting to think that it's, that so many of it is not actually run by Italians anymore. And that, it sounds to me that you're saying that the paradox of Chinese espresso is basically that the seemingly very Italian social and cultural tradition is actually being preserved by Chinese immigrants and their diverse clientele. And you came to all of this as an anthropologist, so, and someone who's fluent in Italian, I want to add. What kinds of things did you bring from the anthropologist toolkit to your research? What kind of ways of seeing?
So first of all, I have my language skills. So to do such a research is not that easy. So it means that you have to be fluent in Italian, but also in Chinese. Also, I had my background in Italian studies. So it's not just the language, but also the familiarity of Italian culture. And as an anthropologist, before going to the field, I was prepared with some other skills like how to do the field work, like participant observation. So I imagined that when I arrive in Italy, I should have frequent interactions with local Italians. So I tried my best to find my host family, which is a local Italian, and live with them and join their everyday life to see how the coffee culture is part of their everyday life. And when I arrived, I didn't know any Chinese there, but since I look Chinese, right? So I just enter, the coffee bars run by Chinese. I tell them that I'm Chinese, I'm here, what I'm doing, do you want to talk to me? I was kicked out by several Chinese baristas, but some of them also accepted me. So I tell them, okay, I'm here, I'm a student. But sometimes it was difficult to explain to them what I'm doing. Some of the Chinese immigrants, they didn't have academic trainings, so they don't understand what means dissertation. So I had to find a way to explain to them what is a PhD dissertation. And also, I'm Chinese there, so I encountered a lot of racism or discrimination that other Chinese immigrants also experienced there. So I had to figure out who I am. It's not just with other Chinese, but also with other Italians. I speak fluent Italian, but that's not enough not to be discriminated against in some occasions. So many things that I have prepared in advance, but more are prepared it's like a on-the-job training, I also developed my barista skills. I learned from other Chinese friends or interlocutors. I told them that I would like to learn how to make coffee so I can experience the whole process, right?
And so you also learn how to be a barista, working for one for a while part-time in order to get to know the field better. So crucially, Grazia, can you make a good cup of coffee?
Yeah, I mean, if you don't mind, I would love to make a coffee for you guys, but I'm not sure if it's good enough. I mean, espresso coffee, no doubt, it will be definitely good, but cappuccino, not now. Yeah, maybe 10 years ago, I could make better, cappuccino because it needs a lot of practice. But I can introduce you to many good Chinese baristas in Italy.
Yeah, I've got an espresso machine at home. Love making coffee, although I have to admit that to being a bit of a geek about it and ordering specialty beans to put through my grinder and doing all of the research, I'm maybe a bit too obsessed. But I want to get some historical context here. How did the Chinese Italian coffee bar come to be a thing? That I think the 2008 financial crisis played a role. Am I right?
Yeah. So according to the official statistics, or they have annual reports about coffee bars in Italy, So the annual report of 2008 described the foreign ownership of bars in this way. They are really news in recent years. So it means that before that, it was not a thing. It's quite new. It's a recent phenomenon. And since then, more coffee bars actually had closed than were opened each year. It means that if there are no Chinese or other immigrants buy their coffee bars, there are even more closed than opened. So we just think about this phenomenon from two sides, from two ways. So from the Italian side, the many previous Italian coffee bar owners are just too old to follow the business. Many of them have reached the age of retirement, and their children do not want to continue because they consider that this business is just too labor intensive, and the kids probably have received better education. They went to the college. They would like to join the white-collar labor market. They would not like to stay behind the coffee bar counter for more than 10 hours or 12 hours like their parents do. And from the Chinese side, so the Chinese coffee bar owners that I know usually have been in Italy for at least 10 to 15 years, and many of them were seeking new business opportunities, either to survive economic crisis in 2008, or they try to maximize their family income by using all the available family labor, because many of their children come of age and they are looking for job opportunities. And many children, they arrived in Italy in their teenage years, so they had language difficulties. They go to school, but they do not have the chance to go to college. And what can they do? Go back to family business and help their parents. Yeah. So Italians are selling coffee bars. Chinese want to invest in some small business. Perfect. That's a match.
Okay, fascinating. Yeah, that's all really interesting. Can you give us an idea of what these coffee bars actually look like? Like, could you mind painting a picture for us, perhaps of your favorite coffee bar, or maybe even the one that you worked in?
This is actually a hard question. Let's say there are all types of coffee bars in Italy. You can find the fancy coffee bars. You can find those neighborhood coffee bars that you can never find online reviews for those, right? There are bars where you can only find men, but there are also like gender balanced, friendly bars where I can feel comfortable to bring my laptop to write or just spend my afternoon time. Those bars are similar to the American, Starbucks or other bars, right? But if we talk about a typical coffee bar, if you ask an Italian, what kind of let's say a traditional bar in their mind, they probably would not say any kind of bar similar to Starbucks. They would say a neighborhood bar, a bar which has a tradition, which has a history. So I'm not going to describe my favorite bar, but maybe one of the bars that I think is a typical bar and a bar that I frequented a lot for my research. This bar is where I learned barista skills. So it is located in Bologna's historic center, but on the back street, so it's not that busy street. A local Bolognese friend described the location of the bar as the periphery of the center. So it is kind of a minimalist bar. It's not fancy at all, and they don't have a lot of paninos to sell, but they do have all kinds of drinks, soft drinks and beers, wines, but they don't have a lot of choices of cocktails. They do have the Italian national drink, spritz, but they don't have, for example, mojito. And if you want to buy cigarettes, you can also find tobacco products there. And for example, packed ice cream, snacks. They have a price list, which was printed on the white paper, hanging just next to the coffee machine. So it's very minimalist. And so that bar has kind of three semi-separate rooms. So that you enter, you see the bar counter, and then with a couple of tables. And then there is a separate room for slot machines. There's another separate room, and in the afternoon you will see a couple of retired men, pensioners, to just stay there to play cards. They spend hours there, to play cards in that tiny dining room. And if you see the coffee bar in Italy with that kind of structure, this is probably a traditional bar with at least the history of 50 years or even more.
Yeah, right.
Like this bar that I'm describing started in the fascist period.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I think you were talking about how, even though it's traditional, you've got different people who would go there. I mean, this one that you've described is owned by Chinese people in that, you might go there and work, presumably other non-Italians would go there and visit it as well. And I wonder if we're kind of thinking about the way in which the different population groups in Italy might mix in these spaces, including this coffee bar that we're talking about in Bologna. We're getting to the theme of conviviality, which, as Amit mentioned in the intro, is this idea or maybe a particular standard to do with living with difference, although people do define that differently. We'll get to your own take on it in a moment, as well as how others might have seen it. But for now, you found a number of things that challenge assumptions about what are sometimes called immigrant-host relations, and we wanted to talk through those with you. So one was how Chinese baristas in Italy were actually coming together with other populations, so native Italians, but also new immigrants, not to change an existing form of convivial local culture, but actually to preserve and perpetuate it. Can you tell me about that? This point about preservation rather than rupture.
So when a Chinese family buys a coffee bar, they do not really want to change anything. They try to keep everything as the same as before. So they try to learn to make exactly the same coffee as before, as a previous owner. And they will ask their customers, is my coffee good enough for you? They try to get to know all the special requests from their customers, and then to make, to keep they try to keep the service and the products as the same as before. And in terms of social skills, they try to fit in the community. For example, so before running the bar, they probably, like us, we all know that politeness is very important in the service industry, right? And in the bar that I described, so my barista teacher told me that, yeah, that's a general rule, but it's not always the rule, because they know the customers, they know who wants what, right? And they kind of customize the service. Someone likes teasing, and then someone's likes, it's not just the cold, fake smile, right? Someone really appreciates the real, like, human interactions with emotions, with feelings. It's not necessarily polite. And then they develop this kind of interpersonal relationship in their everyday social interactions. And that also maintains, the vibe of the coffee bar, the sociality of the coffee bar as the same as before. At least they are trying to do that. That's why I always think that they are not trying to bring the Chinese culture into the Italian bar. Actually, they try to hide the Chineseness in the bar.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I guess there's a tie-in with my own work here, in the sense that the English pub is often seen as in decline and under threat, particularly in towns and cities across the UK that, like, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, had what we call here a colour bar, which is kind of de facto segregation, which kind of didn't allow Indian workers who were working in factories alongside white workers to actually drink there, but then slowly started to take over some of these pubs and ended up running some of these pubs, which we now call kind of desi pubs, Indian run pubs. But I guess a key difference is that they serve a range of different Indian food. So they maintain kind of the mundane, everyday elements of the pub, quite drab decor often, serving a range of English pints, but then serve Indian food, which I think is like an interesting difference against the backdrop of just like an English pub. And it also makes me wonder whether it's maybe just easier to pour a pint than it is to make a cup of coffee. And maybe that's why it was a bit more seamless. So I think there is something in that in terms of thinking about the difference. So why is it that these places remain so Italian? Is it the result of some kind of xenophobic pressure to maintain the authenticity, or a genuine desire to preserve the culture? Or do you think maybe a bit of both?
This is a good question. I don't think the Chinese baristas really have this idea of preserving Italian culture. It's for economic reasons, right? They are small business owners. They want to make money. So they think, they do think the coffee bars are Italian culture, and they know that their customers would like to continue this kind of a daily ritual, so they try to do that. So that's why in my book, I emphasize that the coffee bars is a kind of an everyday site of compromise and adaptation. So the Chinese, buy the bars for the economic reasons, and then the Italian customers go there because that's their cultural practices, right? The immigrant workers go there because they don't have many other places to go for their social lives. So different local populations go there for their own purpose, but somehow work together to construct a convivial space.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think that's something that's quite similar with the desi pubs and the idea that some of me and my colleagues are looking at. Because in the bars that you studied and in the pubs that I'm thinking about, the clientele is a lot more complex than people might typically think. So immigrant populations are also attending these coffee bars, right? And another thing then that challenges this notion of the immigrant-host relations.
Yeah, so I think the Chinese managed coffee bars are kind of a new form of contact zone in the critical theorist Mary Louise Pratt's term. So native Italians, Chinese immigrants, and other immigrant groups, they meet there for different purposes and develop their social relationships. So they all need to learn how to interact with each other. So the Chinese baristas, they learn to serve different and diverse customers, and they deal with racism against them, and sometimes they also kind of deploy the Orientalism in their own favor. For example, the Chinese women, the Chinese female baristas, sometimes they pretend not to understand the dirty jokes, the harassment, because I'm Chinese, so I don't understand. That's logical. Okay. And some Chinese would complain about racism and discrimination with other immigrants, And some Chinese owners, they would also bring in some new dishes. For example, the Chinese dumplings. I saw a Chinese owner made dumplings for her customers for the Christmas. Okay, saying that, okay, if you like it, just eat it for free. And then the customers would order, oh, this is so good, I would like to order some from you. And then she would make some dumplings for them. But these kind of new dishes would not destroy the main, the vibe, the main product list in their business.
I feel like some of what you're talking about here is getting to this immigrant-host relationship, maybe some nuance to this idea of conviviality, because you're talking about experiences where people might be experiencing racism, some kind of like clash in a way, like a clash sort of oppositional thing that could be happening with different groups in these spaces. But then at the same time, that there's compromise and adaptation and agency. And I'm really interested to know how you see conviviality after being in these spaces and how you would talk about the way conviviality plays out in the Italian coffee bar of today.
All right. So first of all, I would like to add one point to the previous question. So I think the convivial social space in the Chinese run coffee bars is often produced through kind of encounters of friction. Yeah. So anthropologist Amit Singh defined the friction as awkward, unequal, unstable, and creative qualities of interconnections across differences. All these kind of frictions happening every single day. Probably some mistakes happen, misunderstandings happen, but they have their way to solve those kind of problems and then still make friends, construct their own social relationships. So back to the idea, the concept of conviviality. This concept, the conviviality, literally means the art of living together. And the whole book, Chinese Espresso, is about how people from different backgrounds live together. Okay, so the concept of conviviality has its roots in the Spanish term convivencia. And it is a kind of idealized notion describing, an ideal situation, the conviviality between Jews, Muslims, and Christians in medieval Spain, Iberia. And recently, this concept has been increasingly used by the migration scholars to describe this kind of coexistence, cohabitation, and interactions between native Europeans and new immigrants from different parts of the world. And they often see, so in European scholarship of migration, they often see conviviality as some kind of a goal, an ideal goal to achieve. But in my book, I use conviviality as a reality that immigrants learn to deploy and cultivate in the face of economic uncertainties and structural inequalities. So I take the immigrants' perspective, the Chinese immigrants' perspective, to explore how they perceive and live within a new European society. But I want to make it clear that so conviviality that I describe has its spatial boundary. So it's within that coffee bar space, and it is characterized by contingency and compromise. And for me, so the Chinese espresso is emblematic, it's a symbol of life in pluralistic and postmodern urban societies. It's a kind of a new normal in which immigrants would assume fundamental roles and positions of taste production and place making that people would normally think that only people from the local cultures, local society would be able to do.
The way that you're describing conviviality, it really sounds like you're walking this very nuanced line between there's the political ideal that's described in theory, but then there's actually these sort of everyday practices that people are doing to enact it in real life. You write of everyday convivial bricolage, and it's this very interesting kind of tension between the political ideal and then how it's actually lived out in these sort of bounded spaces and through particular practices. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Actually, the Chinese espresso exposes the paradox between the apparent multi-racial and multi-ethnic conviviality within the coffee bar space and the hostility against immigrants prevalent in a wider white-dominant European society. And this is another paradox that the book is about.
Yeah, that's really interesting because you touched on kind of the political climate in Italy, which I think is really central, right, to what was going on. So do you mind speaking a little bit more about how the Chinese espresso coffee culture you studied has evolved against this backdrop of the rise in the far right in Italy? Something we hear about quite often in the UK in the media here.
Yeah, as I mentioned, the phenomenon of Chinese espresso is a good example against the popular discourse of the rising right-wing politics, right? They are not stealing the jobs. They are, on the contrary, they are maintaining the Italian culture, the local culture, the urban identity.
I really love the way that these sort of Chinese immigrant-run bars are actually, they're both sort of contributing to the maintenance of Italian culture at the same time that they're challenging the idea that immigration is necessarily going to, fundamentally transform what it is to be Italian. Like, there's a very interesting thing happening here. We're going to move on to our next section, but before we do that, we're going to have a quick word from our producer, Alice.
Hi, we hope you're enjoying today's episode with Grazia Ting Deng, thinking differently about coffee culture and conviviality. We're now well into season 3 of Uncommon Sense, and whether you're joining us for pleasure or work or study, we hope it's a really valuable resource for you. And if you've had a chance to look at the sociologicalreview.org, maybe to get some readings from our show notes or hear our other podcasts, you might have noticed the Sociological Review Foundation is a charity. We're all about advancing public understanding of sociology, and you could say that this year, still, that's needed more than ever. So, we've a favour to ask. If you can, please consider making a contribution to help the foundation keep bringing this podcast to you. Just head to donorbox.org/uncommon-sense. That's donorbox.org/uncommon-sense. You can find that link in our show notes, and there you can make one-off or repeat donations to directly support the making of Uncommon Sense. All gratefully received, and of course we're also grateful just for you listening in. Any feedback or suggestions, we're at uncommonsense@thesociologicalreview.org.
Okay, so Grazia, each month we ask our guests to tell us about something that gave them some uncommon sense. It could be a thinker, a book, sometimes even just one sentence that stuck with them. And I don't think I've ever mentioned mine before, so I'm going to throw mine out there now. I remember reading the Italian social movement theorist Alberto Melucci as a PhD student, and it totally changed how I think about politics. And it is, still influences how I think about it today. Maybe more on that on another show. Amit, have you ever had a similar moment? Maybe someone who's made you think differently about conviviality?
Yeah, and likewise, it was when I was modelling through the PhD and didn't really know where I was going or what I was thinking. But I remember reading Les Back's seminal New Ethnicities in Urban Culture in my first year, and it really helped me make sense of what was happening in my field site, particularly what he calls the metropolitan paradox, which he uses to refer to how instances of rich multicultural exchange, kind of like some of the instances you were talking about earlier, Grazia, can happen proximate to instances of like racism, which I think is a really instructive way to think through some of the complexities of urban multiculture and convivial encounters more broadly, especially against the backdrop of the looming shadow of racism within and outside of those.
I also really love Les Back. We did an episode of the show with him called Listening a while back. I was such a fangirl in recording that episode. It's one of those great things when you meet someone whose work you really like, and they're also just really nice to chat with as well. It was so good. Okay, well, Grazia, I understand you wanted to mention The Invention of Tradition, a collection from the early 80s, edited by the historians Eric Hobsbawm and Terence Ranger. It looks at how what appear to be old traditions are sometimes, in fact, rather recently created, often to serve particular ends. Can you tell us more about that book and what's in it?
Yeah, so the book actually talks about many traditions actually appear to be very old or claim to be very old, are often quite recent in origin and sometimes even invented, right? So this phenomenon actually is often associated with the construction of national identity, a national culture, as if a culture practice is ahistorical, that automatically implies continuity with the past. For example, Hobsbawm gave the example of the Highland tradition of Scotland. So the supposedly ancient Scottish clan tartans were actually quite modern. Yeah. So this historic perspective inspired me to think about the notion of tradition and modernity, to examine, the Italy's well-known coffee tradition. So probably you all know that recently Italy has applied to UNESCO to add Italian Espresso to its official list of intangible heritages of humanity. And they promoted the espresso as a symbol of what was made in Italy, an Italian lifestyle that combined tradition and modernity. So when I did my research, And I discovered that actually espresso is quite a recent invention. The first espresso machine was invented in late 19th century, but the popular use of espresso machine only happened after the World War II. So the Italian coffee industry promoted espresso as a symbol of what was made in Italy, an Italian lifestyle that combined tradition and modernity. They also branded themselves as the defenders of Italian coffee culture that usually traces back to the early modern Venetian coffee houses. But when I interviewed local Italians, the native Bolognese, who are more than 70 years old or 80 years old, they all gave me a different story. They told me that, so when I mentioned, our bars in the old days called cafe, coffee house in Italian, they would say, no. So in the past, so there were always like 2 or 3 cafes in the city centers in Italian cities, but most of the bars derived from osteria. Nowadays people would think osteria as the local tavern, traditional wine house, but for many local Bolognese, osteria actually was a previous version of coffee bars.
Yeah, and just generally, I think it's so important, isn't it, to challenge the assumption that food and ethnicity just neatly map onto each other. Because in reality, what appears often to be a national food culture in Italy or beyond is often, in fact, wrapped up in global chains, right? Both of products, but also of labour.
Yeah, so, the food, in this case, espresso coffee, so the taste of espresso coffee is actually industry regulated. So it's not related to ethnicity. So they do not have a natural connection. So as I mentioned earlier, so the Chinese baristas in Italy mostly act as the final technicians in the coffee making process. They do not necessarily have an understanding of coffee blending or the global commodity chain of coffee. They only need to develop their technical manual skills of this highly standardized commodity through the operation of the espresso machine. So it is the standardized industrial production that has made the mass consumption of coffee commodity possible, but not the ethnicity of the barista. But if you go to Italy, they will, now probably not, but in the beginning, when the Chinese immigrants started running coffee bars, if you ask Italian at that point, so they will say, "Oh, Chinese? Can they make coffee? It's not possible." But now, many also realize that actually many Chinese make better coffee than Italians because it's their own small family business. They care about their families. They are not the hired labor, right?
We've just been talking about a book whose ideas have inspired you, and it definitely sounds like they apply to the case of Italian coffee, or indeed Australian coffee for that matter. But I wanted to also note that your own book is very richly written, full of really great descriptive passages. I wonder whether there's someone whose writing then has given you a kind of uncommon sense, has shown you that there's more than one way to write a captivating ethnography. And by ethnography, I should add that we mean, in the most basic of terms, a descriptive written study of a particular community or culture, typically based on actual close observation and engagement by the researcher.
I would say the first time when I read Clifford Gertz's ethnography about the Balinese cockfight, I was really amazed by his thick description of the everyday drama and how he was accepted in the local community. I was like, so we can write the ethnography in this way. It's not just full of jargons, all those terms that no one could understand except the anthropologist, right?
Yeah, I also really like reading rich ethnographies. I think one of my favourite is Courtney Bender's Heaven's Kitchen book, which is kind of suitable to this because it's talking about kind of relationships between people in a kitchen. This is sort of like a kitchen in New York that was preparing meals for people who are suffering in the AIDS crisis. But those sort of really rich descriptions of spaces and interactions within them, and kind of the way culture comes out in these places is just such interesting to read for me. Amit, is there anything that you really like reading that helps you to write as well?
Yeah, the first ethnography I read was Philip Bourgeois' In Search of Respect, which is an ethnography of people selling crack in El Barrio in New York, in Spanish Harlem. And there's a lot going on, that's probably a little bit you wouldn't get away with today, let's say that, with modern ethics committees. But it's like really amazing and really, really rich. And obviously I love a bit of Les Back.
Of course. We're going to put all the recommendations for all of these books are going to be in our show notes, and including that Clifford Geertz recommendation from you, Grazia. But, our time's almost up. Before we go, we wanted to talk to you about pop culture, and we're looking for a recommendation from you that speaks to our theme or themes today, coffee, culture, or conviviality. While you're having a think about it, I'm going to throw one in, which is the Jim Jarmusch 2003 film Coffee and Cigarettes. It's a series of vignettes of famous people having a chat over coffee, basically, and they are often disagreeing with one another, but in a very amicable way. My absolute favourite is the chat between Iggy Pop and Tom Waits. Amit, is there anything that you want to chuck in here?
Honestly, I'm just not a very cultured man, so I've got nothing, I'm afraid. But that's, what would you want to mention?
Well, so my book is about coffee and coffee bars. So I also have several ethnographic descriptions of coffee bars. But if you want to have an image, I would say that we can see the convivial coffee bars in many movies and TV shows that were set in Italy. For example, the movie Call Me By Your Name.
Yeah, I love that movie.
Right? So for example, I think it's in the first 5 minutes already, the two guys entered the bar in the piazza, and then the bar was full of retired men, except for the female barista behind the bar counter. And all the men were sitting there chatting, smoking, drinking, playing cards. And that is a typical neighborhood bar in Italy, and potentially bought by the Chinese immigrants. And more closely related to the Chinese Espresso is another movie, Italian movie called Shun Li and the Poet. Was directed by Andrea Segre, released in 2011. So that movie is about the friendship at the margins of the romance, of course, between the Chinese barista, who is also a single mom and an undocumented migrant, and a local fisherman, originally from Yugoslavia in the Venetian town. I have very conflicted feelings about that movie. So the movie actually captures, that kind of a mutual distrust, stereotypes of both Chinese communities and local Italian society. And it also shows its anti-racist and anti-xenophobic intent. But it also ironically adopts a Orientalist description of Chinese immigrants in Italy. So it implies that the Chinese mafia is a mastermind behind the Chinese businesses in Italy. And this is why there are so many Chinese people running coffee bars. And in my book, I specifically commented on and criticized this kind of a rumor about the Chinese mafia in Italy.
Thanks so much for those recommendations. That is all we're going to have time for today. Thank you so much for telling us about your book and about your research, and it's been really great to chat with you.
Thank you.
And that's it for this month. As ever, you can catch today's show notes, including a great reading list with pieces from the Sociological Review journal and magazine, plus the thinkers we've discussed today, by digging into the Uncommon Sense section on the podcast page at thesociologicalreview.org.
And given our theme, I'd like to suggest you go back and take a look at our episode on cities from season 1 with Romit Chowdhury. There's also Spatial Delight, another podcast from the Sociological Review Foundation, hosted by Agata Lishak, and all about space, society and power, inspired by the geographer Doreen Massey. I'll be back next month with Alexis and more Uncommon Sense.
Our producer was Alice Block and our sound engineer was Dave Crackles. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.
Bye.